Hi there. Today we're going to talk about the Old Testament, particularly Genesis, as it is viewed by literary critics. Now, it's very important to me that you understand something about our discussion of Genesis. There are many ways to look at any text academically. Historians look at a text for historical accuracy. Theologians look at it from a religious standpoint. Archaeologists and anthropologists study it in terms of the cultures of antiquity. And literary critics study it for literary qualities and historical and cultural context. And that's how we're going to be looking at it. I am not telling you what you should adopt as a personal belief. And I am in no way telling you that what you believe or what any church or other religious teacher has taught you is wrong. I'm not doing that. I respect everyone's right to make up his or her own mind about religion, and I respect all beliefs. But for the purposes of this class, we will all do our best to set aside our religious views to consider and learn about Genesis in terms of what literary critics say. And while those are the only points that we're going to discuss in class, and the only points that can be discussed in exam papers, I'm not trying to present this information as absolute truth that should override anything else you believe. Not at all. This is a literature class, and we are discussing this text, which is very important in Western culture, as a literary text because that's an appropriate way to view it in this class. But it is not an attempt to affect anyone's personal belief system. Okay, the sources for this presentation are Marshall Johnson et al., John Gable et al., and John Salemer. Now, you should remember from studying MLA documentation in 101 that et al. Is an indication that there are more than 3 authors of a book or an article. And that's what the et al. Means after Marshall Johnson and John Gable. We simply name the first author that's listed and then follow that with et al. To keep from having to name several people every time that we offer documentation. Okay, now, literary critics Marshall Johnson et al. Explained that it's very difficult for people, particularly people in Western culture, to view the Old Testament as we would any other text. One factor that makes studying the Old Testament as a text difficult is the intervening 2,600 years or so between its origin and now. And that difficulty is magnified by the cultural differences between our modern technological society and the agrarian-based society of the Old Testament's origin, Johnson et al. Say. Of course, the same could be said for the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, and for that matter, most of the works that we're going to study this semester. But according to Johnson et al., the factor that makes studying the Old Testament more difficult is that we all tend to view it through our individual perceptual lenses. And those lenses are composed of what we think we already know. Many people, particularly Christians, believe they know what Genesis says, even if they've never looked at it at all. But our so-called knowledge of the Bible is actually a combination of what is actually written, the interpretations that have been presented as fact by various religious denominations, myths that have been woven from the Bible combined with other literary texts such as those written by Dante and Milton, and ideas of what we think it should say, Johnson et al. State. The greatest factor that prevents our studying any portion of the Bible as we would other texts is our view of it as the official Word of God, according to Johnson et al. But we have to keep in mind that no part of the Bible is like the Quran. The entire Quran was written by one person, the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Muslims believe that the Quran is an exact copy of a text that exists in heaven and was dictated word for word to Muhammad by Allah. It's forbidden to make any changes to it or to edit it in any way. In fact, for centuries, it was forbidden to translate the Quran into other languages, Johnson et al. Say. Strictly Orthodox Muslims continue to hold very strong beliefs about how the Quran can be studied. In fact, the reason we don't study the Quran in this course is because a Muslim student that I had in class when I was teaching it told me that strictly Orthodox Muslims, like his grandmother, would not be able to read the Quran in English or to listen to someone teach it who isn't even a Muslim. Now, Judaism and Christianity is different. Jews and Christians may not agree with what literary critics say, but they're not forbidden to listen to it. Now, neither the Muslim nor the Judeo-Christian approach is wrong. They're simply cultural differences, and we're going to respect those in this class. I want to say this one more time. It is very important to me that you understand that I'm not telling you to change your beliefs, and I'm not telling you that what you have been taught is wrong. I respect your beliefs no matter what they are, and those of various religions and each of you matter far too much to me for you to think that I'm trying to change your mind about something that is a part of your belief system. I'm not. We're just looking at what literary critics say about the Old Testament, and particularly Genesis. Okay, now Johnson et al. Maintained that it might be easier to study the Old Testament, including Genesis, as a text if we have an understanding of its origins. Now, as Johnson et al. Point out, most Christians in Western culture view the Old Testament as some kind of a precursor to the New Testament that foretells the birth and teachings of Jesus. Now, while that is a legitimate way to view the Old Testament, and I'm not saying that it isn't, it's not what it was actually written to be, according to Johnson et al. For the purpose of this course, we will view Genesis as separate from any connection that we believe it has to the New Testament, because we're going to look at it from the aspect of the purpose that it was written to meet. Okay, so what was that purpose? Well, the Old Testament was written to be the holy text and the law of the Hebrew people, Johnson et al. Tell us. It includes the early history, literary writings, religious laws, and prophetic writings of the Jewish culture. Now, the Old Testament has been very important to the Jewish culture because the Jewish faith is the single common factor that has preserved the culture throughout the centuries, as Johnson et al. Point out. For very lengthy periods throughout history, beginning before the time of Christ and lasting so far all the way up to World War II, or after World War II, the Jewish culture has at times not even had a common land to call home to unite its people. What they did have to hold them together as a people was the book, and much of its content was written specifically to establish and maintain a cultural identity, Johnson et al. Say. From the beginning, Judaism was unique among the cultures of Mesopotamia, such as the culture that produced the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we've already read. In ancient Mesopotamia, only the Jewish culture was monotheistic, meaning that only the Jewish people believed that there was one and only one God, according to Johnson et al. And it was the belief in one God that formed the unity of the Jewish people as a culture and a nation, even when they had no land to call their own and were spread out throughout the nations of the earth, Johnson et al. State. Let's take a look at the beginnings of the Old Testament and where it came from. Although it appears first in the Old Testament, Genesis was not the first portion of the Old Testament that was written, according to John Gable et al. Gable et al. Tell us that the Jewish nation was divided into two separate nations after the death of King Solomon. The larger nation of Israel, as we see here, was to the north, and the smaller kingdom of Judah, was to the south. Now, early in the 700 BCs, that northern nation of Israel fell, leaving only the tiny kingdom of Judah, Gable et al. Tell us. And in 622 BC, Josiah was the king of Judah, and he ordered repairs to the Temple of Solomon. Now, during this restoration, a scroll was found and brought to the king, Gable et al. Tell us. Josiah studied the scroll, and it seemed to him that it contained a body of ancient legislation, including part of Mosaic law, as it is now recorded in the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Now, Gable et al. Explained that King Josiah was appalled to discover that the Hebrew people and the nation were not following these Mosaic laws. So he undertook sweeping religious reform based on that document, which became the very first text of what would grow to be the Old Testament. Scholars believe that the scroll that was found is most likely the central section of the book of what we call Deuteronomy. Specifically, it's chapters 12 through 28 of Deuteronomy. And that portion includes material that was later reproduced in Exodus, including the gist of the Ten Commandments, Gable et al. Tell us. Prior to finding this scroll, the Jewish nation had existed without any knowledge of the Mosaic law, or at least any written knowledge. So the Jewish canon began with that one document and grew over the next 5 centuries. Let's talk a little bit about authors of the Old Testament. Once again, it's fraught with difficulty. It's very difficult for scholars to determine the authorship of any part of the Old Testament, according to Gable et al. The prophetic books of the Jewish Bible, which are books like Jonah, Micah, Nahum, and so forth, are probably the easiest, because a lot of the content is believed to have originated with the men whose names they bear. But even in that case, the arrangement of the content in some of those books seems to have been decided by someone other than the original authors, Gable et al. Say. Some of the books in the section that is referred to as by the Jewish culture as the writings, and that would include the books of Ruth, Esther, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Jonah, each seem to have been written by a different single author, but we have no idea who those authors were. Also, Job and Ecclesiastes, in particular, seem to include additions that were written by other authors than the original author, and they weren't always sympathetic to the original author's intent. Now, the history of the Bible as a text is further complicated by redactors, who were as important in compiling the text as the actual writers were, Gable et al. Explain. Redactors were people who compiled finished versions of the books using the sources that they had available to them at the time. We have no idea who those people were, but we know by the condition of the texts that have been found by archaeologists that there were redactors. Changes in style, wording, and intention indicate that in some cases, redactors worked with partial versions of books and pieced them together to make a book, while other redactors worked with 2 or more completed versions of a book, and they blended them with lesser or greater success, Gable et al. Tell us. Now, we tend to see these people as editors that are working with materials that were already written. But in some cases, they possibly subtracted from or added to the text for reasons of their own that could have been based on either literary, religious, or political factors, or maybe some other motivation that we know nothing about. Genesis is a good example of a book that was written by combining different versions. So let's look for a little while at the original versions of Genesis. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are known as the Pentateuch, or the Law. And each of those books is a combination of 4 different versions of the books, according to Gable et al. One version is the D version, and it's the oldest version. In current Bibles, that includes only Deuteronomy, particularly the section that was discovered when the Temple of Solomon was renovated in 622 BC and brought to King Josiah, Gable et al. Say. Of the versions of the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, the oldest version is believed to be the Yahwist, or J version. And it's called the Yahwist version because it refers to God as Yahweh, according to Gable et al. The next older version would be the E version, in which God is called Elohim, Gable et al. Tell us. Now, the 4th version is the priestly version, which for Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers combines the J and E versions without attempting to maintain any kind of consistency, Gable et al. Explain. For example, the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 is the Elohist version, the E version. The creation story in Genesis 2 and 3 is the Yahwist, or the J version, and it's completely different in terms of the chronology of creation, as Gable et al. Point out. But the P version was written by the Jewish priests who were called Pharisees, and they included in it both the J and E versions of the creation story instead of deciding on one or the other. Now, including 2 versions with no concern for consistency explains why we have 2 completely different creation stories. And there are other stories in Genesis that we also have 2 versions of. In many cases, the differences are minute and have not had a lasting effect on Western culture. However, if we look at the order of creation on the table in the supplied handout, we see at least one difference that has been used at various times in order to influence culture. And this is one of the instances in which what we think we know about Genesis is different from what is actually in the text, and it's one that has served some groups very, very well throughout history. If you ask most people how long it took God to create the earth, they would reply, 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. Okay, great. But that day-to-day breakdown of creation appears only in the Elohist version, which is in Genesis chapter 1. Now, by the same token, if you ask those people how woman was created, they would relate the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib. But that story appears only in the Yahwist version, which is in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. So people tend to rely on one version of Genesis for part of the story, or for most of the story, but they rely on a completely different version of Genesis when it comes to the creation of woman. In the Elohist version, which is chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 27 states, quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." In other words, man and woman were created at the same time in the same way. And that's very different from the Yahwist version, in which God creates man first and then creates all of the other animals to keep him company, ending with the creation of woman from man's rib. And they're both excellent stories, and far be it from me to try to determine which one is correct. But the point is that throughout history, those in power have often used that Yahweh story of the creation of woman, in which she's created from man's rib, to insist that she is secondary to man by design. Even though Genesis 1, the Elohist version, says that both man and woman were created at the same time in the same way, which implies equality. Okay, let's take a little aside here. Since we're looking at the creation story in some depth, let's consider another way that what we think we know about Genesis has affected our culture. Most people believe that Satan tempted Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. But if we look at what Genesis actually says, there is nothing that indicates that. It says that a serpent told Eve that she could eat the fruit. But nowhere does it say that the serpent was Satan. In fact, the best known piece of writing in which the serpent is actually Satan is the epic poem Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, that's an excellent piece of literature, but it's not part of the Old Testament. It's purely fiction. So what? Well, let's look at the situation from Eve's point of view if we read what is in Genesis without adding other information. We see that God tells Adam, one of God's creatures, not to eat the forbidden fruit. Then the serpent, another one of God's creatures, tells Eve that she can eat the forbidden fruit. Now, while it's not necessarily true, and I'm not arguing that it is, it could be argued, based on biblical information, that Eve's main mistake was in believing one of God's creatures over another one. But in spite of that, women have been blamed for bringing sin into the world throughout the history of Christianity. And women are particularly held responsible for men having sexual urges, as we're going to see in other literature that we read. Because, of course, men have no sexual urges unless women force them to have them, right? That's why we don't see things like homosexual rape in men's prisons, because sex is entirely woman's fault. We're going to see in the literature we read, and as we discuss the historical context for those literatures, that belief that woman is to blame for man's sin and that woman is to blame for man's sexual sins in particular, that belief has been used and held against women for centuries. And it all comes from a reading of Genesis that says that the serpent is Satan and that Eve sinned because she was tempted by Satan, when there's absolutely no evidence in Genesis that that's true. Okay, now that we know a little bit about the origins and the history of Genesis as a text, let's take a look at it as literature. According to literary critic John Salemer, Genesis, as the name implies, is the book of beginnings. Chapters 1 through 11 present the story of primeval history, beginning with creation. That includes the story of man's downward spiral and three great punishments: the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the flood for which Noah builds the ark, and the creation of languages and dispersal of man following their attempts to build a tower that would allow them to climb to heaven, Salemer points out. But chapters 12 through 50 present the patriarchal history of the Jewish nation and features the stories that we read of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, Salemer states. Now, one important aspect of literature is genre. Genre refers to the type of writing that a piece represents or could be classified as. Modern genres for books, film, and television that we're much more familiar with include classifications such as history, biography, romance, mystery, horror, comedy, science fiction, drama, soap operas, and all the other genres that we're familiar with from simply living in our culture. Now, the older genres are different, and they include genres such as epic poetry, and that's what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. But according to Salemer, the most obvious genre that includes Genesis would be the genre of heroic narrative. As Salemer points out, Genesis is largely a collection of hero stories that are built around the exemplary life of a protagonist whose experiences represent the conflicts and values of the community that produces the stories. Understanding the characteristics of a hero in a literary work is really important because the heroes capture the popular imagination, but they also reflect the traits that a culture admires and promotes a culture's self-awareness, Salemer says. So let's take a look at Genesis as an heroic narrative. According to Salemer, each of the heroes in Genesis is unique, and each of the hero's stories has a distinctive flavor. Also, not all of the heroes are men, as they were in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and as we shall continue to see in the Iliad and the Inferno. Other ancient literatures were written by men exclusively for the entertainment of men, and women were simply not seen as playing a significant role in that world, except as supporters of men and their goals. But the Old Testament is very different in that women do play a significant role. In fact, looking at the Old Testament as a whole, the first non-military ruler of Israel, and those were called judges, was a woman named Deborah. But even in Genesis, women play a significant role. For example, believing she is too old to have a child, Abraham's wife Sarah interprets God's promise of descendants as numerous as the grains of sand in a way that aligns with laws of the time. At that time, a handmaiden could become pregnant by a woman's husband, and if the handmaiden gave birth in the wife's lap, the wife was considered the mother. And Sarah does this. And this decision actually ends up having a major impact on world history. Because when Sarah does become pregnant, she exiles her handmaiden and her handmaiden's son, Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is viewed as the father of the Islamic people. And for obvious reasons, this situation led to a conflict between the Islamic and Hebrew nations as to which culture is the heir to the covenant that God made with Abraham. And that covenant, of course, was that if Abraham followed God, God would reward him with a land of milk and honey, meaning Israel, and a line of descendants that would be as numerous as the grains of sand. Now, many additional events and conflicts obviously have ensued between the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, and the Muslims concerning, for example, who is the rightful owner of the land that we now refer to as Israel. But even though there have been all of those additional conflicts, this conflict over who is actually Abraham's legitimate heir was the beginnings of that cultural disagreement between the two groups. Now, as we saw, this passing down of God's covenant with Abraham along family lines produces a conflict in Genesis itself that's completely separate from the Muslim-Israeli conflict. And a woman plays a very significant role in that conflict, too. The covenant was supposed to be passed down to the oldest son. But Isaac's younger son Jacob tricks his older brother Esau into selling his birthright. But it's Rebekah, Isaac's wife and Jacob's mother, that actually devises the plot to disguise Jacob as Esau in order for Jacob to actually receive Isaac's blessing. Now, within the context of those individual stories about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, the women's actions could be viewed as acts that ignore their husbands or even attempt to deceive them. But their actions are also heroic attempts to ensure that God's covenant with Abraham is passed on. So we do see women heroes in the Bible, even in Genesis. Now, the first hero story in Genesis is the story of Adam and Eve. And as Salemer points out, Adam and Eve are characterized as prototype parents of the entire human race. But they're also archetypes, that is, typical examples, of sinners, because they are punished for disobeying God. And disobeying God is how sin is often defined in Western culture, according to Salemer. Another hero story in Genesis is the story of Noah and the flood. Now, Salemer says that Noah is characterized as the only person of integrity in a time that is overrun by evil. And it is his integrity and faithfulness to God that leads God to decide to save him and his family, as well as all the animals, instead of destroying all life on earth. Another tale is the story of Abraham. And that story is a quest story, kind of similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, except, of course, that Gilgamesh undertook quests to further his own interests in immortality, while Abraham undertakes his quest under direction from God. God asks Abraham to leave his homeland and follow him to a new land. And God promises that if Abraham will do that, he will be taken to a land of milk and honey, and his descendants will outnumber the grains of sand on the earth. That is the covenant that God makes with Abraham. Now, the word testament is a synonym for the word covenant, and the entire Old Testament arises as a result of God's covenant with Abraham. But Abraham isn't only on a quest for a land, he's also on a quest for a son. The elderly Abraham and his wife Sarah are childless when God enacts this covenant. Now, Abraham's faith in God leads him to know that he will have a son, but he's not really sure how that's going to be possible. And so, as we've discussed, he and Sarah try different approaches on their quest to meet that goal. Now, Jacob's story is very different from Noah's and Abraham's. While Noah and Abraham are very godly men who have no problems obeying God, even when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, Jacob is a man who has to struggle to be godly, according to Salemer. His natural instinct is to be something of a trickster, and as we've seen, it's through tricks that he ends up inheriting God's covenant. But after receiving Isaac's blessing, which passes the covenant on to him instead of to Esau, Jacob flees. And the rest of Jacob's story relates his efforts to overcome his natural tendencies and lead a godly life so that he can be deemed the proper recipient of the covenant. The final heroic tale in Genesis is that of Joseph. Salemer points out that Joseph's story at first depicts the hero as a suffering servant. At the beginning, he's Jacob's favorite son, and Jacob's preferences for Joseph lead his brothers to throw him into a pit from which he's kidnapped and taken to Egypt. And once he's in Egypt, he also suffers imprisonment because a married woman falsely accuses him of making sexual advances. But Joseph remains faithful to God's covenant, And so eventually he rises to a high position in Egypt. His position, as well as his vision predicting a period of famine, enable him to lead Egypt to stock grain during a period of abundant crops. So when the famine does occur, Joseph is in a position to save his father and brothers, which means he saves the future of the Hebrew people. Now, while Genesis can be viewed as an heroic narrative, as we've seen, it can also be viewed as an epic narrative, according to Salemer. An epic narrative tells the story of the formation and identity of a nation, particularly the formation of a nation under divine providence, according to Salemer. As we've discussed, while each of the heroic tales is distinct and offers differing insights, all of the stories from Abraham through Joseph are significant in how the Hebrew culture was created and passed on. And as we recall, Johnson et al. State that the Old Testament as a whole was written at least in part to provide unity for the Jewish people, even in the long periods when they were spread across the known earth and had no land to call their own. So with the focus on God's covenant with Abraham and the lineage through which it is passed on, Genesis plays a very important role in that function. But Salemer points out that Genesis is epic in another sense as well. It is the story of the beginning of what biblical scholars refer to as the overarching story of salvation history. Salvation history is the history of God's protection, judgment, and redemption in dealing with the human race, Salemer explains. And we do see God both judge and redeem the human race in several Genesis stories, most notably the story of Noah. In that story, if we recall, God actually regrets creating the earth because all of the people are evil, and he plans to destroy it. But Noah's integrity and faith provide God with the way to redeem mankind and provide it with a future. But whether we compare Genesis to other ancient heroic narratives or other ancient epic narratives, Genesis is very, very different. In fact, to be honest with you, its differences are so stark that one of the easiest approaches to writing the first exam paper is to compare the heroes of Genesis to either the heroes of the Epic of Gilgamesh or the heroes of the Iliad. As we have seen, heroes of the Epic of Gilgamesh were largely military heroes, and we are going to see that to an even greater degree when we study the Iliad. But as Salemer tells us, Genesis focuses not on military victories and battles, but on family life. It's how family members relate to each other, how they interact that is the focus of Genesis. There are no battles in Genesis, no kings, no warriors, armor, swords, shields, or any of the accoutrements of battle. Strength and bravery are not the main characteristics of the heroes. In fact, Abraham is an old man. There are no physical descriptions of the heroes because factors such as physical strength really aren't that important in domestic life. The action of the stories and the resolutions of their conflicts occur between husbands and wives, fathers and sons, and among brothers. As Salemer concludes, it is a domestic history, not a military one. And as we've already noted, the people, the heroes of Genesis, are not military heroes. They are simple shepherds, hunters, and farmers, living in a rural setting, as Salemer points out. There are no great cities like Uruk in the Epic of Gilgamesh or Troy in the Iliad. The events occur among hills, valleys, streams, and deserts, Salemer states. They are stories of elemental life, the type of life that most people lead, instead of the stories of a chosen few who reach great heights as warriors and kings. But as Salemer points out, they are no less heroic and epic narratives than other ancient writings that do focus on military and political life. Well, I think that should provide us with some new information about Genesis that we might not have known before. I hope that this presentation helped you. And of course, if you have any questions, all you need to do is drop me an email through Canvas. I love hearing from students, so make sure you email me about absolutely anything. We'll talk again soon.